それでは時間となりましたので、セミナーを開始いたします。本日、座長を務めますのは、九州大学アジア・オセアニア研究教育機構創発推進コーディネーターのキム・シューマッハ准教授です。シューマッハ先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much, Nice Sensei, for the introduction. Please let me welcome everyone to the 124th edition of the Brown Bag Seminar. And today it is my immense pleasure, and it's with great. I'm looking forward to hear from Danielle Ellenby. She's the was part of the public relations initiative at the Kyushu University. Miss Ellenby, she graduated from University of Oxford with a bachelor's in biological sciences, and she has a master's in science communication from Imperial College. Afterwards, she became a science communication fellow at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, then moving on to become a science writer at the same institute in Okinawa. And finally, she is now we are happy to have her as the science communicator at Kyushu University. And today she will talk about an extremely important topic, which is science communication. First, she will explain what it is, and then she will go on to say, why is it important? Without further ado, I want to hand it over to Ms. Ellenby, our science communicator. So, Danielle, please. Looking forward to your presentation. And later, if you do have questions, please post those in the chat, either in Japanese or in English, and then we will try to respond to those, or Ms. Ellenby will try to respond to those. I will hand it over. We're looking forward to your presentation.
All right, so thank you so much for the introduction. It's really my pleasure to be here today. I want to start off by just kind of explaining a little bit about how I got into science communication. So after finishing my bachelor's in biological sciences, I originally went into the education sector, and I was doing educational video content creation, and I was tutoring, and I got a lot of pleasure out of communicating with students and seeing how they understood the material. But the actual material was not so interesting to me. I really wanted to learn more about cutting edge science and to challenge myself to communicate things that were potentially very difficult or had ethical considerations. And so that's kind of what led me to science communication. And then from finishing my master's, I ended up in Japan. I've loved it and have been here ever since. All right, so my talk is, what is science communication? Why is it important? And then finally, just a little bit about some of the science communication activities that are happening in Japan. All right, so science communication is very broad. When I say to someone I'm a science communicator, their first question is, what's a science communicator? And science communication is really a variety of practices that connect science and society. So a science communicator is someone who aids in connecting science and society. But again, that still feels really vague. It's still really broad. And so I think the easiest way to describe what I do is science communication is communicating with a non-expert audience or a lay audience about anything that relates to science, technology, engineering, or maths. So all the STEM-related topics. And why do we do that? What's the goal? Well, the target of science communication is to inform, educate, and raise awareness about scientific topics and issues within society, and to increase kind of the public engagement of science and scientific literacy in society. Now, scientific literacy is a bit of a complicated word. It means kind of how well science is understood and approached within society. And so really the simplest way I can define the goal of science communication is to make science approachable and understandable for everybody so that everyone can engage with it. And there are really never-ending selection of ways that you can communicate science. And so this is just a handful of them. So you have government initiatives. You can have museum exhibits that are funded by governments. You can also have science communicators that are doing things individually. Maybe they have a podcast, or maybe you have a television company like BBC who create documentaries. You also have news articles, and you have infographics and radio programs. And these are all kinds of different ways. But scientists also communicate science all the time, even within the scientific community, with things like conference presentations or university festivals. And finally, you kind of also have policy papers. So this is kind of a much more hidden area of science communication that the public don't really know that much about. And this is often science communicators will sit in committees and advise politicians on evidence that supports or doesn't support particular policies related to science. So public health policies, like how we react to the COVID-19 pandemic. All right, so with all these different methods, as I kind of started to say, they all involve reaching different people. So who's involved in science communication? Everyone. Absolutely everyone in society is involved in science communication. But there are different levels to this. So as a scientist, the kind of first level of science communication happens within the scientific community. And so this is in processes such as with your labs. Maybe you have meetings, or maybe between two labs, you have collaborations, you have peer reviews for papers, and you have scientific conferences. And then spreading out from that, you have the different sectors of society. So you have the public sector, such as government and education and schools. And then you also have private sector, such as industry. And you can reach these different levels through science communication, through policy, and through the transfer of kind of, with collaborations with industry, you can transfer kind of science innovation into products. And then finally, science communication spreads out to the general public and the youth or the students. And so science communication is important for providing them with knowledge. It's important for providing them with technology. And it can also inspire curiosity or answer questions that they have about the universe. It can help inform them on health and well-being and help them make informed choices. And so whenever we're communicating science, we really need to think about which level are we trying to reach? Who is our audience? And then this will affect many other things. How do you frame the problem that you are trying to communicate? And what level of difficulty is the content of what you're communicating? So for example, when you communicate within the scientific community with experts in your field, you might use scientific terminology. And this might be the best thing to use because everyone knows exactly what the precise definition is. There's no ambiguity. But when you communicate with the general public, this scientific terminology becomes jargon. It becomes something that is a barrier to accessibility. And so we have to think about ways to remove the jargon and to make it simple and clear and approachable. And the other thing that we have to think about are kind of how we communicate. Like, how do we think about our audience? And there are kind of two main models in science communication. And the first model is kind of an older model. It's called the deficit model or the information deficit model. And this model kind of thinks about scientists as the experts that contain the knowledge and the public who have a deficiency or lack of knowledge. And communication flows one way, in one direction, from the scientists to the public. And this model kind of assumes that any kind of public skepticism about science, such as maybe skepticism with environmental policies or GM crops, this skepticism comes about because they lack the information. So they don't have all the scientific facts. And it assumes that if we provide them the facts, if we throw them the facts, if we tell them how a vaccine works, if we show them how genetically modified crops are safe, that they will accept it. But this model has a lot of flaws. So first of all, you can't just throw facts at someone because the way that every person receives information is very different. They have different lived experiences and they have different values. And so the model that people are kind of moving towards and aiming for is something called a dialogue model. So in a dialogue model, communication is no longer one way. It's two-way and it's between lots of different stakeholders in science communication. So the scientists, the public, and then also industry and policymakers, they participate equally in discussions and debates about science and technology. And science is no longer at the top and considered to be the expert knowledge. Instead, cultural knowledge and experience knowledge. So what is the experience of the person that you're talking to? They are considered to have equal value. And so this kind of level of engagement is really, really important when you're trying to communicate with the public about something, because how you communicate really affects how they respond. And so one example of this is with the COVID-19 pandemic. So obviously during the COVID-19 pandemic, the vaccine came out and governments were tasked with trying to ensure that enough people in their population were vaccinated to create a herd immunity effect for those who weren't vaccinated and to prevent the health system from being overwhelmed. And so different governments approached this in very different ways, had very different messages. Some had enforcement policies, some left it voluntary, and some were kind of in between where they kind of put barriers in place that made it inconvenient if you weren't vaccinated. But one thing that one study looked at the effects of how we frame the messages urging people to get vaccinated. So instead of just throwing the facts about like, what is an mRNA vaccine? How does it work? Why is it safe? Instead, they kind of framed it based on, are you vaccinating for your individual protection? Are you vaccinating to protect your local community? Or are you vaccinating to help your country? And they found that different people in this study reacted very differently depending on which framing method they were given. And so understanding your audience's worldviews is essential because some people are more individualistic and they will respond more effectively to a message that frames it in terms of individual protection, whereas others maybe are more altruistic or more collective. And so they will respond better when you frame it in terms of community or country. And we also have to think about the fact that different people also have a different lived experience. So maybe they are concerned about their own health. Maybe they have immune deficiencies. Or maybe they've had an encounter with a pharmaceutical company that's left them suspicious. And so you have to kind of consider all of these, you have to encompass the audience in order to effectively communicate. And this isn't easy. It's impossible to talk individually to every single person of the public in order to give out a public health message, but you have to try with focus groups and things like that. And so now I kind of want to just take a breather for a second and ask people, why do you think science communication is important before I kind of get into my own ideas on it? So let's hope this works. I've created a little Slido poll, and I would like people to type English preferably, but Japanese is fine, I can translate. Why do you think science communication is important? Why do you think you should do science communication? And I'll give you about a minute for things to get in. Let me know if you have any difficulties with it. One participant is typing. That's great. All right, so I'll just leave it for a minute. To combat fake news and greenwashing. Great. Yeah, so greenwashing, for those who don't know, this is when companies will try and sell a product or sell some kind of policy of something that's helpful for the environment, but actually it's not. Let me just translate this one. To understand risk, yeah. When having surgery or using medicine at a hospital, a scientific literate public is a safe public. No correct information, no right decision. Science is fun, yes, and I like to share with others. All right, so we're starting to get a diagram forming. People are talking about people. There's a few more people typing. I'll leave the poll active, so if people want to continue to write, they will be able to. Not sure which one came in there. To get people closer to the science. To get understanding and cooperation from society. All right, I'm going to move on now. It's been about a minute, but please feel free to keep typing. All right, so when I think about why science communication is important, I kind of split it into two different viewpoints. And so one is, what's the importance of science communication for society? And then what's the importance of science communication for the science or the scientists, the university, the people doing the science? And so the importance for society, the first one that's often mentioned is kind of boring, but there's a kind of duty. The taxpayer, the public, they often pay for most of the research, the science that's created. And so scientists have a duty to inform the public about how their money is being spent. And so the taxpayer has the right to receive this information. And so it's important to provide it. The second one that started to come up is the idea of combating alternative facts and misinformation. So we live in a post-truth society, and things like issues with vaccination can spread virally on social media. Treatments for COVID-19 that were not in any way considered safe or effective proliferated on social media. And so it is important for society to have effective science communication in place to kind of start to combat some of this misinformation, things like greenwashing too, as was mentioned. And then thirdly, we kind of already talked about a bit, but science communication is important because without science communication, you need it to empower the public to have informed dialogue, to talk about science that impacts their lives. And so this can be things like policies in climate change, global warming. It can be about whether or not it's okay to grow GM crops in your country. The UK had a huge debate about that in the early 2000s. And how we should embrace things like gene therapy. Is it okay? Is it safe? Can we do it on children? So these are all issues that society really needs to decide. And in order for them to decide about it, they need to understand it. And so one example from kind of Japan, Kyushu University, was a recent study this year. It actually hit the New York Times top firsts for the year today. And this was Professor Katsuhiko Hayashi was able to create baby mice from 2 male mice. And so obviously this is a breakthrough research. This is really important. And it raises ethical questions because it could enable fertility treatments in the future for humans to have 2 male parents. And so therefore, public discussion and engagement is really important. So as Hayashi said in the BBC article, if people want it and if society accepts such a technology, then yes, I'm for it. So the public needs to be at the forefront of this discussion about how we do things like fertility treatments. Like people will have many different views that come into this, religious views, views on what's natural, views on what's safe. And there's always this risk of unintended consequences. So yeah, so this is one of the reasons why science communication is so important. And then finally, it's also important to restore and maintain public trust in science. And so one example of this was what happened in Japan after the Great East Japan earthquake, when the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant had an accident and exploded. And unfortunately, the government failed to adequately and effectively communicate the science to the public about the risks and about the radiation. And the scientific experts kind of mirrored the government approach. And consequently, there was a massive loss in science and experts and the government after the earthquake. And so one survey which said, should the direction of research and development be decided by experts who are well-versed in the subject? This survey took place in November 2009, before the earthquake and the nuclear disaster, and then after in December 2011. And there was a huge difference. So in November 2009, 78% of the public agreed yes, or maybe yes, that direction of research and development should be decided by experts. But by December 2011, that value had almost halved to 45%. And so after this, there was really a push from the government to restore public trust in science. And so the Science and Technology Basic Plan 4, which was released in 2012 after the earthquake, really emphasized the importance of science communication and the idea of there being open dialogue and transparency, because communicating science is messy and sometimes scientists don't know the right answer, but it's important to make it clear that the science is unclear. It's important to make it clear that we don't have all the answers and that science is not the truth in order to keep trust in science. And one of the kind of effects of this loss of trust in the experts was a shift in science communication in Japan. Instead of it being such a top-down approach, that was actually a bottom-up approach. A lot of local communities formed their own organizations to talk about nuclear risk, to talk about science and radiation levels, because they didn't trust what the experts were telling them. All right, so we've talked a little bit about why science is important for scientists. Now we're going to talk quickly about why it's important, why it was important for society. Now we're going to talk about why it's important for scientists. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to be as quick as possible. So there's so many reasons why doing science communication can benefit a scientist individually. So it can help you secure new grants. If you're able to explain your research in a clear and succinct way, you have more chance of convincing funders to back your research. You can reach new collaborators, and you will improve the presentations that you give at conferences and the quality of the papers that you write. If people can understand your paper, they're more likely to cite it. And science communication in terms of outreach from your university can also really increase your paper metrics. So how many times your paper has been viewed and how many times it's been cited. And so to give you two quick examples, this is a piece of research that I did a press release about a couple of years ago, and it is in the top 1% of metrics for scientific research with a outmetric score of 1,714. And it was picked up by well over 100 different news outlets. And then the same thing happened with this paper here, which is about hurricanes lasting longer and staying stronger due to global warming. And this one also was covered by almost 300 news outlets, and it was viewed thousands and thousands of times. And yeah, it's already got a lot of citations. And both these papers were published by PhD students. So this really kind of goes to show that even if you're a PhD student, if you communicate about your work, if you reach out to the press office, you could see an absolute explosion in publicity. And then finally, we saw one person say this answer: why do you communicate science? Because it's fun, because you find your research interesting, you want to tell the public about it. And maybe also learning how to talk about your science, which might be really complicated. You might be doing quantum physics or some really obscure niche branch of chemistry. Maybe you want to talk to your family about what you do, but you haven't been able to find the way yet. Science communication can help you. And then also, if you tell others about your research, they might also be able to tell you about your research, and you might see your research in a new light. And then in terms of universities, so that's why does my position exist, really? It's about fulfilling their civic responsibility. And so all universities kind of have a vision, and most visions are really connect science and society. So for example, Kyushu University's Vision 2030 is about driving social change with integrated knowledge. And OIST, where I used to work, their vision is the advancement of knowledge for the benefit of humanity. So it's kind of explicit in both these visions and in numerous visions of universities that you need to connect science and society. And so as well as that, there's also numerous benefits for the university. It can really help increase their reputation. It can increase their brand visibility and their credibility. And then from that, they can attract talented students, talented researchers and faculty members, and they can produce better quality research. And this can increase their position in university rankings. And then this will help them attract more talented students, more talented researchers and faculty members. It can also help them raise funds and get new grants and create collaborations with other universities and other industry partners. All right, so just to briefly finish off, talk about science communication in Japan. So Japan is very interesting because it's a very insular country, because a lot of science communication in Japan obviously happens in Japanese. And so at the domestic level, science journalism is very strong. But historically, there have been a lot of challenges reaching an international audience, mainly due to the language barrier. However, things are starting to change over the last few years. And that is kind of where my job comes into play. So I am part of the Kyushu University Public Relations Initiative, along with my colleague Raymond, and there'll be one other person joining us next year. And our job is to communicate internationally. And a lot of other universities like Nagoya, Hokkaido, OIST, they also have brought in people with an expertise in international press releases to communicate science more effectively to an audience outside of Japan. And so just to kind of explain a little bit about how we do our outreach, in Kyushu University, we have domestic PR and we have international PR. And the domestic PR is written in the Japanese language, and a press release is often drafted by the researcher, and then it is sent out to the Japan National Press Club. A scientist may do a press conference. And so in this process, the researcher is very much at the forefront of science communication. So it's important for them to kind of have the training and that they need to be able to do it effectively. And then on the other hand, we have international PR, and this is press releases that are created by me and my colleague Raymond. And we distribute these press releases to different sites. We go for Eureka Alert. And this is basically a site that journalists can access, and they can see the press releases and decide whether or not they want to cover it. Another example, which is more predominant in the UK, where I'm from, is Alpha Galileo. And then as well as kind of press releases, there's kind of numerous other like university SciComm initiatives that take place. So there is university open days, there are school visits and campus tours. We use social media to try and reach. We hold science cafes. So Raymond runs Nerd Night Kyushu, which doesn't talk just about science, but pretty much any nerdy topic that you're interested in. So if you're interested in nerdy stuff, definitely give that a follow. And then we also produce things like annual magazine to kind of talk about some of the research and initiatives going on at the university. And finally, we also do media training for researchers. And then outside of universities, but supported by universities, there's also a growing number of networks of science communicators in Japan. And so just to list a few of them, there's the Japan Association for Science Communication, which is predominantly in the Japanese language. There's Japan SciComm Forum, which I'm involved with, which is predominantly in the English language. And then the Science Communication Society of Japan, which is a new and upcoming one. And the aim of these kinds of networks, of these organizations, is to kind of boost science communication in Japan, discuss best practices, highlight best practices, and learn also from the international community about how to effectively do science communication here. And so, as I mentioned, I was involved in Japan SciComm, and this is an annual conference. And this year it was hosted by OIST, my old workplace, in November. And so around 70 science communicators, researchers, students came together to discuss and highlight best practices. And yeah, it was really fun. If you're interested in getting involved or attending, please give me a message. I'd love to get you involved. And just generally get involved in science communication yourself. So start communicating with the public. You can do this directly through social media. You can use your research budget to fund illustrations, to fund outreach events. You can attend trainings and conferences. And most importantly, please, if you have research that you're going to publish, please reach out to us and we will do our best to promote it. All right. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. This was fantastic, actually very insightful presentation for myself as well. And it seems like, yeah, we do have quite a lot of questions. Yeah. So I think it's the first question is by he asks, slide, agree with the statement that science communication in Japan still remains extremely closed to open reach overseas. Could you please give us some advice on how to effectively reach our communication science, such as Science Cafe, different forms, like Q-AOS has the Brownback seminar series or other seminar series. So what have you seen are some of the most efficient ways for Japanese researchers who might not be as proficient in the English language to reach an international audience?
So I think probably the best way for a Japanese researcher who is less confident about using English is probably to go through us, since we are kind of that bridge for them. And so if they have research they want to promote, it doesn't even have to be a finding at the moment. It can be a feature story about their general research. Then this is something that we can create an article about, or a video about, or an audio interview. You know, there's any number of different things that we can do in order to reach an international audience if they are less confident with English themselves. Otherwise, things like Japan SciComm Forum, because it's predominantly English language centered, it was online last year due to the COVID pandemic, and we actually got attendance from a very international audience. So there's a lot of people out there that are interested in SciComm in Japan, that are interested in science in Japan. And so, yes, it's about finding these kinds of online initiatives, I think, in order to reach them.
Thank you. So the second question is in the trust in science, and I would kind of paraphrase the question but what are some of the, because you gave the example of Fukushima and the incident, but what are some of the observations that you made that is particularly efficient in increasing, for example, trust in science in a Japanese context, or in let's expand it also for some of the participants today, like in an Asian context or, but a Japanese context primarily.
A Japanese context primarily. Yeah, so I think there is trust trust is being restored here. I think predominantly scientists need to make it clear that they don't have all the answers. Science is not truth, even though we like to think it is. But it's not. It's our interpretation of what we think is happening. And we're human and we are prone to errors. And so really emphasizing the humanity of scientists and also the scientific process rather than giving science just as cold, hard facts. I think that's really important because people will emphasize with scientists if they see them as humans. They will trust them more if they see them as humans. If science is kind of this, one way that people like to talk about it is like an ivory tower. And this is where it's kind of isolated from society. It's kind of up here by itself while the public's down there. That's a recipe for distrust and misinformation. So really it's about coming to the level, it's about two-way dialogue with the Japanese public. So more dialogical approach. Japan actually still inherently works on the deficit approach. They think that if they just give the facts to the Japanese public, that the Japanese public will receive it and accept it and support them. And it's just not true. Japanese people have their own concerns about things like nuclear energy and safety. And so, yeah, it's about dialogue. There needs to be more effort to engage the Japanese public and like take into account their view.
Yeah. Here's a question that goes more to your expertise as a science communications expert in general, not necessarily, but it goes to how should researchers operate in an environment that is, for example, where you have shifting governmental like flows where in one government is extremely pro climate change and then suddenly it shifts to an anti-climate change environment like we saw in Australia or in the United States. How does a researcher communicate in an environment that might be not as favorable anymore to the specific discipline or topic that they are covering? What kind of advice or how to navigate that properly?
That's a difficult question. And I think it depends what kind of country you live into. Do you live in a country that values free speech, or do you live somewhere where it's kind of more determined by the government? I think if you live somewhere where you have free speech, like Australia and that kind of stuff, then it's kind of up to the scientists to take a little bit of an initiative to push the conversation forward. So perhaps you can write an opinion piece in Australia, they have The Conversation, which is a very reputable outlet for where scientists can give their opinions about things. So you could write an opinion piece if you're an expert in that field. You can also kind of do more outreach on a local level as well. Maybe you can talk to your local schools, your local students. But it's hard because maybe you start to lose funding and that kind of things when government policies change. And so, yeah, in that kind of situation, I'm not a scientist, so I know much less about that kind of stuff, but perhaps there are kind of other avenues of funding that you can approach. But if you can use any of your funding, such as Kakenhi here in Japan, for science communication, that can help you kind of get more public support, and then hopefully the political opinion will shift back.
One question, because you particularly gave a shout out to STEM, but does science communication involve all of the academic disciplines like humanities, social sciences, or is it primarily STEM in the sense? Because I see, at least from my experience, in a lot of Japanese universities, there's an extreme like bias towards the natural sciences, the more traditional sciences. And I think that is something that when I was in Todai, I was actually discussing with the science communications officers there, that basically 95% of all the news stories were primarily on natural sciences. So what
Yeah.
can,
So
and
actually
then further,
this,
what can a science communication, what can a science communications officer do to kind of spread that a little bit out?
Yeah, so actually Kyushu University is, especially in Japan, is one of the leaders, I think, in this, because unlike pretty much any other university I can think of, we have a science communicator position for social sciences and humanities. And that's the position that we will be filling in January. And so, yeah, it's true. If you look at like Eureka and stuff like that, they do have like an avenue for humanities and social sciences, but it's hardly used at all. There is definitely a bias towards the natural sciences. I think more universities need to put in a position like Kyushu University has that is specific for social sciences and humanities. And then also, I guess, within the science communication field, within our community, we should probably start putting more of an emphasis on that, because at the moment, a lot of the conversation is about applied science. There is this huge bias towards applied science. And recently, in the last couple of years, we've seen a shift in conversation towards basic science. Like, how can we talk about fundamental science that doesn't necessarily impact humanity right now? But we haven't yet seen the shift towards social sciences and humanities. Maybe it feels even more far removed sometimes for humanities and how it can have an impact. But yeah, I think probably this SciComm community needs to do more to kind of emphasize that. And then universities, public institutions, companies, they should also put in positions that emphasize that.
Okay, we have tons of questions, but I kind of want to limit it to 2 more questions because this is a topic. And please do reach out to Danielle because she's obviously an expert in this field and she gave a lot of avenues. So even if today's Brown Bag seminar ends, the conversation does not end. So please do reach out to her. Lots of helpful advice. But the first question is probably maybe for aspiring science communication officers. Why did you choose this field and why did you choose to do it in Japan?
So yeah, as I kind of briefly said at the very beginning, I chose this field because I found it really rewarding to have those conversations with people where you see them understand something, where you see them get inspired by something. And it's even more rewarding when this is something that they weren't familiar with at all or didn't like before. And so this is kind of the experience that I was having as an educator. And from that, I kind of just wanted to take it further. I wanted to challenge myself more. So I really love science. I love learning about recent scientific discoveries and really inspires me. And I wanted to share that with other people, but I didn't actually want to do the science. So science communication was the best avenue for me in order to kind of still get to talk about something I love and also get that reward for seeing the science, seeing the public kind of respond to the engagement. And the second part of that question, how it was, sorry, can you remind me?
Why Japan? Why Japan?
Why Japan? Really, like everyone asked me this, why did you come to Japan? Interestingly, I had two students from Japan in my master's course, and the feeling I had from them was that science communication in Japan was quite behind compared to the UK and compared to Europe, which were kind of at the forefront of science communication. So I wasn't really thinking about Japan as the place I was going to go. But then I saw the internship offered by OIST, Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. And it's for 6 months, kind of fully paid trip out to there. It's a beautiful tropical island or subtropical island. For those who haven't been, I really recommend. And so, yeah, I was just like, this is an amazing opportunity. It will give me a chance to build my portfolio and develop my skills. And yeah, I applied for it, I got it. And then I ended up loving Japan so much and Okinawa so much that I stayed. And yes, Japan is behind compared to the UK, But that's more of a challenge. And I find it really exciting with things like Japan SciComm Forum to kind of be at the forefront of pushing science communication forward in Japan. So I find that really rewarding.
And the last question is kind of like an amalgamation of different questions. So you mentioned that over time, like it shifted from a top-down approach to a bottom-up approach. But in the light of so much fake information being out there right now, and especially, what would you suggest? How can we reach with especially young people, like for example, people who are on TikTok or so? That is not usually where science people are to combat like fake news or stuff like that, like fake information. And those are the people who will vote in the future as well. So they need to have informed decisions based on facts. How do you reach those? What is an efficient bottom-up approach that you have seen or that you could recommend to reaching groups of stakeholders that scientists traditionally do, even with a lot of the modern tools, are not necessarily able to reach yet?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's difficult. It's difficult to reach people in communities that don't have any interest in science. I think this is an age-old problem. Certainly for young viewers, why shouldn't we be on TikTok? Certainly individual scientists, there's actually quite a lot of scientists on YouTube, on Instagram, on TikTok, who kind of do gain traction in a way. And so I think to combat misinformation, I think it's kind of ultimately up to all of us. People who are tired of experts are not going to listen to the people at the top telling them what they say is right. They're going to listen to individual people. And so it's kind of our collective responsibility as scientists to be those individual people, to talk to your neighbor, to talk to your local school students about science, and in a way that you listen to them. So there was a lot of talk at the latest SciComm forum about the best way to do a science outreach. In Japan, often it's a lecture where someone just comes into a school and then just like gives a presentation to the students. But there is kind of a shift in Europe and stuff to find ways to do science outreach where you really focus in on one specific niche that you want to look at. So this might be disadvantaged school children or people who don't have access to internet normally. And can you find a way to talk to them? Can you find things that they're interested in and then bring science into that conversation? And then by establishing that trust, by establishing that you're invested in them, then they will have trust in you.
That's a great conclusion to today's talk. Excellent talk. Tons of questions that I could not even get to due to time limitations. So please do reach out to the Science Communication Department. They will be able to help you and even provide a lot of advice. So it was fantastic. So with that, I'm now handing it over to the Q-AOS administration, and who will provide a little bit of information about next week. But let's all thank Ms. Ellenby from the Kyushu Science Communication Department. And with that, thank you very much. And please do get in touch with her to get your research more out there and more acknowledged. Thank you very much. And with that, I hand it over.
エレンビさん、シュムハ先生、ありがとうございました。最後に事務局よりご案内させていただきます。まず次回のブラウンバックセミナーのご案内です。次回は来週12月20日水曜日12時10分より、九州大学歯学研究院の重村則敦教授より、味覚と健康と題し講演を実施いたします。詳細はホームページをご覧ください。